a good start to our Democratic People's Republic of North Korea show. As always, look at this team right here. I'm Alf Lamont. Cheers, everybody. Dan, who are you?
I'm Dan Dingman. Cheers to you.
And who is this warrior woman in front of us?
Hello, I'm Amanda Brass. Today I'm drinking Twining's Extra Bold hot tea and a cup of water and a slice of bread in honor of my comrades.
Yeah.
Yes, the famine-prone state of which we will speak to. I am drinking Suntory whiskey Toki. And
very good.
Yeah, I think it might be. I think it's interesting that Suntory whiskey was established in 1923, which is around the time that Japan was causing a lot of trouble for Korea. So this is going to be an interesting. And my apologies to Koreans for bringing a Japanese whiskey. Soju, difficult to get in Sacramento during quarantine. So my apologies for that. Dan, what are you drinking?
Because there were no horses yesterday, I've got myself a nice mint julep.
That is a fine-looking mint julep.
Isn't it? The mint julep's brilliant. It's basically a bourbon slushy.
That's a good description of it. That is a good description of it. So you guys, North Korea. I mean, this is an exciting subject matter, and I think like we're really hitting on the stuff that I think captures our imagination right off the bat, right? Like we're like vampires and Australia, and now it's North Korea, and there's plenty of reason that North Korea like captures our imagination, right? Like every time we take a look at it, we're just like, what the hell is going on over there, right?
Right.
I mean, it's all of these like incredible like they're Dan, I think you mentioned that it looks like a Wes Anderson movie.
It is. There's actually a website I found that's like North Korea is essentially a Wes Anderson film. Everything is perfectly symmetrical. It's kind of fun 60s, 50s looking, and the color schemes, like it looks like a Wes Anderson film.
Yeah.
It's a great website. Like just type it in. Wes Anderson, North Korea.
Yeah, will do. And of course, like the US has a huge and lengthy presence there too, right? And so like I feel like, well, not in North Korea, but in the Korean Peninsula, right? And so we have like a long-standing animosity towards North Korea, but also kind of a fascination with the highly stylized aesthetic that they present, right? And then we see like all of these incredible videos, like Brass's icon this time around is incredible, right? Like let's just analyze this for a split second. Brass, you're a warrior woman, which is kind of a given and a theme throughout these different moments. But this one in particular, right? It's a saber wielding young woman in military garb with a very specific slogan, I assume, behind her. And
right, I'd love to know what it says.
I think it's mostly pushing the aesthetic of our young and our old are eager to defend us. Like, look, she's so proud to get that sword out in front of her, off to her side. It looks like she knows a couple moves.
Yeah,
I think it's everybody who lives here loves this country more than themselves, and we have an army at the snap of a finger.
Right. Yeah. That's pretty spot on.
It's the family.
So I did, like, as always, you guys know how this goes, right? Like I'm just like, oh, I want to talk about like kangaroos, and then we spend like 2 hours on like minute details of what penal colonies are, right? And so we kind of did the same this time, but what I'm going to spare us, and I'm going to spare the audience, and this is a new thing I'm trying out, is we're not going to go for 2 hours on North Korea. We're going to split this into 2 episodes. And the very important reason why that happened. because I came into a natural roadblock, and I do come into these natural roadblocks. Like there are these moments where you're like, oh my God, their history pivoted in a big way here, and I'm about to just dive headfirst into a whole new thing. The thing is, we all kind of like had a moment of awe as we realized that the written history of Australia last week started in 1877. And the history of North Korea, right, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, it doesn't start till like 2000, sorry, not 2000, 1912. And so we're talking a really truncated history here, a really short time span compared to like what we talked about with Vlad the Impaler and even Australia. Like those are considerably extended timelines, but here we're narrowing it down to really like 20th century and how everything developed. But I did want to lay down some groundwork, because I think one of the things we've realized is that this crew here in particular, and guilty, right? We're kind of fond of places that have been a little bit historically messed up. And I think it's important for us to take into consideration the Korean Peninsula and its unfortunate location from a historical and geopolitical standpoint, right? So I think if you look at it here, we're looking at a place that has Russia, China, and Japan as its immediate neighbors. And if you know, if you're a student of history, you know that this area in particular and these three basically slogged it out with each other in a variety of different ways for the totality of history, right? Right. Let me just start with something that struck me. Right? Have you guys ever heard like what like a term used about North Korea? Are there any terms that kind of jump to mind when you think of like North Korea is the blank? Like people refer to it as like there's a saying about North
Hermit.
What?
The Hermit Kingdom.
The Hermit Kingdom. That's right. It is the Hermit Kingdom, right? And I think that's super interesting because the Hermit Kingdom is actually a term used for Korea in 1882. Mm-hmm. And it was in Korea itself was referred to as a hermit kingdom because they really didn't want anything to do with China, who was always, bullying them. And they didn't want to have anything to do with Japan, who was always bullying them. And they definitely didn't want anything to do with Russia, who wasn't bullying them as much, but was bullying them enough. Right. And so you see just kind of this moment, this country just kind of go like, OK, we're just going to isolate. Right. And we're going to kind of step away from all of these places that are pushing. And we saw this with the Romanian Carpathia and Transylvania. Right. All of that pressure from different places and just constantly pushing. And that makes those places insular and also a little bit violent, right?
Yeah, right. And there's one thing I want to point out. I just wanted to verify. I checked the map here. So Korea, in its unfortunate geography, the province that is right above it to the north in China is Manchuria.
And
Manchuria is very heavy on natural resources. It's every single war that involves China, Russia, and Japan, or any group of them, has to do with Manchuria because it's got so many natural resources. And as you can just tell, that's for especially Japan, it has to go through Korea to get to Manchuria.
Right. Exactly. And so for Japan, Korea becomes an important objective, right? And so Japan actually starts attacking Korea in 1592.
Right.
Like that you want some Korean history and you want like a long history that to this day lives on. 1592 is when Japan starts attacking Japan starts attacking Korea, right? And so the animosity between Japan and Korea has existed for years. And when you think about every time North Korea lobs a haphazard ballistic missile into the ocean, right? Like into the Sea of Japan, it's always a reminder to Japan, a historic reminder to Japan of their relationship with Korea. And I think that's interesting, right? Like what you'll find is that North Korea's trial by fire and their birth has a lot to do with the Japanese occupation. And I think when we look at other places, right, like Japanese occupation is synonymous with violence. And that's going to be something that we're just going to see turn up over and over and over. All right, so basically, let's say 1592 on and off for 300 years, Japan keeps plugging away at South Korea, trying to defeat it, trying to get a foothold in. And it took basically modernization and Japan's big pivot towards modernization in the late 1800s to tip the scales on Japan's behalf, right? So Japan kind of went through an overhaul of its, like, anybody seen The Last Samurai?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? So it's basically Tom Cruise plopped into that moment in history where they pushed out the samurai and the imperial government, and Japan sort of went into this like, okay, we're gonna have cannons, we're gonna have artillery, we're gonna have cavalry, we're gonna have riflemen, all in the traditions of the West. And I want to say that like Germans went over there and trained the Japanese, which is a whole bunch of like problems that will eventually come up. But anyway, so in 1897, the Joseon period of Korea, which is like their long national kingdom, kind of comes to an end, and Russia and Japan start kind of fighting over the Korean Peninsula. And basically, the Koreans, because they've been fighting with Japan since 1592, reach out to Russia for help, and Russia's like, cool, right? And so they're like, good, like we can have this sort of legitimizing space in the Korean Peninsula. So that's where they start the Russian-Japanese War, right? And that is, the Russian-Japanese War is pretty famous because, Dan, you wanna chime in on that?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Teddy Roosevelt won the Peace Prize for ending it. Yes.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Yes. And well, I mean, when we visit Russia, this really also starts setting the stage. There was stuff before it for October 1917, and
yeah, and why?
I don't want to spill the beans for a few
spill the beans. I mean, spill the beans as to what happened with Japan versus Russia.
So this was the first time in hundreds of years that an Eastern Asian country has beaten a Western country in any sort of warfare, and it put Japan on the world stage.
Yeah,
right. Like this is a real, like. Let's be honest. At that time, Asia and the Asian countries were sort of meh to the West.
Yeah.
Now they're here.
Yeah, and you're right. Like this was we are here on behalf of Japan, right? And that sent shockwaves through the West, right? Like Japan was suddenly accepted as an equal in the West after this, because they walloped the Russians, and the Russians kind of like, you got to remember that the Russians had the Crimean War against like Allied powers in the West. And then they got followed up by a shellacking from the Japanese Imperial Navy and Army, and all of this happens in the Korean Peninsula. So by the end of the in 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth happens, and that's Teddy Roosevelt
Right.
And basically Korea becomes a protectorate of Japan. And Japan is going to make Korea feel that, right? Like Japan is going to make Korea, they're going to subjugate Korea. And so literally every image and right, like I chafe at this because currently I love Japan, right? And I think of Japan as it is now, and like and I appreciate Japanese culture, but the violence perpetrated on the Japanese, on the Koreans by the Japanese, is not only undeniable, but it is awful, right? And you look at when you look up Japanese occupation of Korea, you are literally looking at pictures like this that start like this and then move to this. Right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And what you see is that there's very little change from the decapitations that we see in those early like paintings to these kind of these crucifixions and these tortures that the Korean people endure at the hands of the Japanese starting in 1910. So 1910 is officially the year that the Japanese Empire annexed Korea. They're just like, all right, we're done. Korea is now ours, and there is a Japanese annexed Korean flag out there, and I'll upload it to the Facebook page. But like there is a Korean occupied Korea whole section of history that goes from 1910 to the end of World War II. What's interesting about this period in time, right? So you think Japanese take over in 1910. Kim Il-sung is born in 1912. And that's super important because modern North Korea uses something referred to as the Juche challenge. The Juche. Gosh, I'm gonna hate myself after this because I'm gonna have to say it a million times. Juche calendar, which starts in 1912 in the birth year of Kim Il-sung, right? So 1910, 2 years later, Kim Il-sung is born into North Korea, in North Korea, into Japanese occupied North Korea, right? So he is born into this violence. And guys, I'm sorry, but this we've seen this before, right? Like we saw this with Vlad the Impaler, born into violence, born into violent occupation, right? And what kind of leadership is forged when forged in this kind of violence, right? And so just so you guys know, in North Korea, the birth date of Kim Il-sung is called the Day of the Sun. And all of those big stadium shows that we see in North Korea, and we will get into those. We'll get into those next week. But you guys know that those are part of the Day of the Sun celebrations, and those are the birthday of Kim Il-sung. So he's born into this moment, and the North Korean history sort of embellishes his childhood from this point in time to accentuate, and I say embellish. There's always a sliver of truth to some of these embellishments. I do feel like there's a propensity for here in the U.S. we have one of the lamest stories about one of our founding fathers. It's George Washington and the cherry tree, right?
Right.
Like, I can't think of anything lamer in U.S. history than, number one, there's zero historic evidence behind George Washington and the cherry tree, right?
There's zero historic evidence that boys don't lie. sorry to break it up, fellas, but come on now. Like, but
Real.
no, but okay, it's aside from that, but I'm not trying to joke about that. I'm trying to joke about why did you deify our first president? We're adding a mythology onto our first president that he does not deserve. You telling me George Washington never lied? No,
Yeah,
come
right.
on now.
Yeah, exactly.
No, plenty of times, right? What I think is interesting, and this is almost for a philosophy discussion, is about countries that aren't really just formed by the people, like say France or England or Spain or whatever, but countries that sort of make their own existence and come into existence, like the United States, like North Korea. They have to start building their own mythologies, right?
Right.
That's more like a human thing, right? Like there's something interesting there, parallels more of a human attribute there. But I think it's interesting that every country does it, but I think there's something about countries that come into existence.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep,
So.
I completely agree, and it is important for a sense of national identity to form these sort of mythologies around folks, right? And so like we look back now on the George Washington myth, with 240 something years of experience, and we can kind of go back and go like, okay, George Washington never told a lie. I mean, just the thought of that. Son, did you chop down this cherry tree? Father, I cannot tell a lie. Right. Yes. What a dumb myth. Like we have no need for that, right? Like
you could never win an insurgency warfare without telling a lie.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
So we have sort of this deification of the founder of North Korea also happening. And I think it's important to draw that parallel, damn it, because it's easy for us to dismiss that, but we also did that, and we also do that. We still look on the founding fathers as a bunch of bewigged infallibles when really they were just as messy as we are today, right?
Oh.
If not more messy, right?
Right.
Like, here.
We don't own slaves. So looking at North Korea through a lens of like, whoa, they're so weird. They're not so weird. They are going through the exact same steps of creating a national identity that we do. And at least in this period of time, you can understand then why stories of Kim Il-sung vowing to defeat the forces of imperialism at age 5, right? Like what 5-year-old says I'm going to defeat the forces of Japanese imperialism and beats up Japanese bullies, right? There's a story of him like throwing a bully across the room because he didn't like how he was, right? And young like child Kim Il-sung lining the roads with spikes to tear the wheels of Japanese police bicycles and defacing primary school textbooks because he hates linguistic imperialism, right? Like what kid does that? And let's say you did do like those minor things, like, obviously if there was a moment, if I was just like, if I was the founding father of a country, Alf Lamont, they would probably look on like me in high school grabbing George Bush 92 posters off of people's lawns and throwing them in the garbage. They would view that as my act of resistance and a symbol of how strong my vision was at an early age. But really, I was just a punk, right?
Right.
And I think that's part of all of this, and something for folks to understand, instead of going like what is like oh my gosh, they're so crazy, they deify these people. We also deify these people, and there's little wrong. It's not that there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that it is not uncommon to add these mythologies to folks that founded the country.
It's a human condition. It
is
part of the human experience. Ancient Egypt did it. The Romans did it. The Chinese did it. Like, right. France, the Sun King, right? Like, come on.
Right.
It's just a natural. It's a natural part of the human experience to do this with your leadership.
Yep, exactly.
So, right, they're not weird. They're perfectly in line so far with everybody else.
All right, so he's not leading a guerrilla war yet. He's still a child, and it's difficult for him, right? Like early on, like early in North Korea, like you're seeing people who are contemporaries of you, right? So there's people who were there that are still alive. So you can't, like, that George Washington and cherry tree mythology, like that didn't really come into being while George Washington was a teenager, or maybe even when he was a president, right? Like that came in later when people needed to bulk him up a little bit.
It feels very 1820s.
It does feel very 1820s. I couldn't agree more. That sort of virtue signaling is super 1820s. So there is still, like, so before Kim Il-sung actually starts like really like starting to fight the Japanese, and he did, right? Like there's no question that Kim Il-sung was a revolutionary and an effective revolutionary leader. Like that don't let anybody tell you that he did not put his money where his mouth was when it came to protecting his country from the imperialists in Japan, right? So that's a done deal. He did go to school in Manchuria, but with all of there's somebody who described the way that current North Korean myths or current North Korean descriptions of his middle school experience, because Manchuria was then, it was a little bit more volatile, but basically they refer to his middle school as a revolutionary Hogwarts. And,
oh my God.
and that's how they refer to it. Yeah, that's how they refer to it. As, like Professor McGonagall teaching, mastery of anti-capitalist, revolution, and like Snape is teaching how to make Molotov cocktails, right? Like, and that middle school is still like a sacred spot for North Koreans, and it was visited famously by Kim Jong-il, and it's definitely a place of pilgrimage in China. Very similar to like places of pilgrimage like Monticello might be in the U.S., right? So, and it's called UN Middle School. And get this from Kim Jong-il's visit to it. According to state television, the dear leader became immersed in thoughts while looking at the precious historic objects that contain the bodily odor of our supreme leader from his school years some 80 years back, right? So you see how these days, how this Japanese occupation and these early days of Kim Il-sung now 80 years later become something to be immersed in the bodily odor of, right?
Because nothing smells better than a 12-year-old.
Right. So in 1931, Kim joins the Communist Party of China because the Communist Party of Korea threw him out for being too nationalist.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Right. Which is something we will visit later.
Yes, it is. And I think that's also super important to realize, right? That Kim Il-sung is Korean at a time where being Korean is not something that is, right? You are a Japanese protectorate, and you are in the Chinese Communist Party, and you're going to school in Manchuria. So let's talk a little bit about Japanese occupation, just to point out why Kim Il-sung was so opposed to it, and why it's important that to him and to North Korean history that he interrupts it, and that he takes an active role in opposing it. And again, forged in fire, right? So Japanese occupation, 5 million Koreans were conscripted for labor beginning in 1939, and tens of thousands of men were forced into Japan's military in 1939. So we're looking at a war. When we think about the war in the Pacific, when we think about the people who died fighting Americans, we think of it only as Japanese, but there were conscripted Koreans in there that were fighting on behalf of the Japanese, right? Forced into this war, dying in this war, right? While their homeland is going through the horrors of the pictures that I just showed.
Right.
And imagine that, right? And add to that 5 million people conscripted for labor. 400,000 of those people that were conscripted for labor died. So 500,000 people died. 200,000 girls and women were forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military. And this is the comfort women issue,
Right.
and it is still an issue, right?
Yeah.
And I think relatively recently the Japanese government apologized for it.
They've also built a statue.
Koreans built a statue, right? Or
right.
the Japanese built a statue?
Okay.
No, I don't know. I'm asking you, Brassy.
I'll fact check myself.
Okay.
There's a statue now dedicated just to that as a solemn apology for that period of time.
I agree, and I think there's also one here in the U.S. But it is a big deal that these women were forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military, and it is also indicative of the brutality and the sexual brutality of the Japanese occupation of Korea. And that is super important, and I cannot emphasize that enough. When your country goes through something like that, and you are establishing a sense of self, that sense of self is rooted in a fight against that oppression. And again, we as the United States like to minimize what North Korea is to like goofy dancing and kids and a Wes Anderson aesthetic. But the reality is that the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea and the Korean Peninsula has experienced horrors.
Right.
And you understand them, you have to understand that. So here's an interesting thing. Oh, go ahead.
About one thing I want to bring up, sort of about the World War II experience of Korea, and I don't know it very well. I don't think many people do, except Korean people. There's a legend about a gentleman that was captured on D-Day who was Korean in a German uniform. This man right here. This is a man that was conscripted. There's
wait, what man? I didn't see the video.
Oh, hold on. There he is.
Okay.
And you can see him. He's in a German uniform.
Yeah.
Those are American soldiers taking his information down.
Yeah.
So the legend and the documentary evidence is very scarce, as in like barely non-existent. But I think the legend is still important because legends are important to history. This is a man that was apparently conscripted by the Japanese Imperial Army, fought the Red Army, was captured by the Red Army, was sent to fight the Germans, captured by the Germans, and then sent by the Germans to go fight the Allies in Normandy, and was captured in France. Like, there's something about that legend. Like, even if it's not true, what a amazing, interesting, sad story, right? About the experience of some of these people. And the Koreans aren't the only ones. There's going to be plenty of groups of people that experience that.
Right.
But this just washed up in history, right?
Crazy. Brassy, do you have something for us about comfort women?
Okay, well, the statue was made by Koreans, and they decided that they'd like to put it in front of the Japanese embassy.
Oh, it's a good place for it.
Japan bristled at that, and apparently they had a little, well, let's say it's a disagreement about whether or not to leave that statue there, or maybe Japan just wouldn't pay Korea this billion yen that they owed them until that statue was moved. It is still there. And on top of that, there is a second statue in Glendale, California at the Americana.
What?
There is a Glendale, California Americana statue dedicated to the comfort women.
Okay, so
I feel like I've heard of this one. This one
so
in California.
The Glendale Americana is like
Yeah.
one of two like crazy over the top malls
Yeah.
in Los Angeles. Like
It's like a Disneyland mall. It's
yeah,
crazy.
it's got dancing fountains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one is there, and then the original one in Korea is called the Statue of Peace, and it's made of bronze, and they put it there December 2011, and it made people uncomfortable because it's
Which
right
it
in front of the
should.
Japanese embassy.
Which
Right.
it should, right? So
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's never be comfortable with it.
yeah.
Right.
I
And
hope
I
we're
think
never just fine with it.
there's a I will always like Germans are okay by me, and the reason Germans are okay by me is that they own and they own their part in World War II in a way that is humble, and they take it to heart. Like that is who they are. They will never again do that, right? Because
they've absorbed it. They've absorbed it, and they take it on the chin.
You have like Turkey with the Armenian genocide. You have Japan, right? Like you have these countries where they're just like the U.S., right? Where we refuse to accept our parts in certain things, and I like that always makes me a little bit angry, right? Because there's nothing holding you back from acknowledging that other than ego. And what is ego in the face of 400,000 women that were raped, right? Like that's it's appalling. It's appalling. 200,000. My bad. So just a couple of more things about Japanese annexation. Korean language was suppressed in an effort to eradicate national Korean identity. You can't even speak Korean. Koreans were forced to take Japanese surnames. Korean culture suffered heavy losses as numerous Korean cultural artifacts were destroyed or taken to Japan. And to this day, much of Korean history lives in Japanese museums and private collections in Japan. Right? Like this is what Kim Il-sung is fighting. And who can blame him, right? Like who can say like this is Kim Il-sung is a notable person and a notable resistance leader and effective resistance leader. And one of the interesting things about during this time, and this will come back around, is he has a secret base in Paektu Mountain. And Paektu Mountain has a different name, and there's all sorts of stuff. But let's stick a pin in that mountain because it will come back around.
Okay.
So by the end of World War II, there's over 850,000 Japanese settlers in Korea. They were trying to basically push Koreans out of Korea. Like this is, and that's 1 million Japanese settlers in Korea. After World War II, back to Japan, right?
Right.
So after World War II, the United Nations planned. This is where it gets messy, right? So, as we know, after World War II, the Western powers, Russia and France and the UK and the US, Russia, the US, and the UK. Let's just be honest; it was just those three. Met up and basically carved the world out in a way that made sense to them without taking into any consideration what that would do to the people in those places. And once Japan was defeated, Korea got separated. It was a trusteeship administration with the Soviet Union administering the peninsula north of the 38th parallel. Flag waving, 38th parallel, very important. And the United States administering the South, right?
Right.
So this was 1948, two separate governments, North Korea and South Korea. Now, during this time of World War I and World War II, it's also important to note what is referred to by North Koreans as the Day of the Star. And and the Day of the Star is important, and obviously this isn't an image of the Day of the Star, but it definitely shows somebody who is involved in there. And the Day of the Star is the birth date of Kim Jong-il.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to go into whether or not Kim Jong-il was born in Korea or in the Soviet Union, which is an assertion made by people who knew them at the time. Official North Korean history states that he was born on the 16th of February, 1942, in the throes of World War II, in the throes of Japanese occupation, in the Mount Pektu area, right? So it's the same mountain that his dad was holed up in as a resistance leader. And they say that his birth was heralded by a swallow. So the swallow, the bird, sang at his birth. That caused winter to change to spring spontaneously. A star illuminated the sky, and a double rainbow spontaneously appeared.
Sounds like Christmas.
Yeah, I mean, it has a star. It has animals kind of instinctively knowing that this happens.
Well, even the Holy Spirit's like the bird, right? Like there's something human about all of this talk.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you can if the bird and the star, right? If the Holy Spirit and the Star of Bethlehem still resonate to us after 2,000 plus years, then surely this story will resonate with Koreans who are trying to create an identity of their own and trying to create something out of the well, we'll see. But also the double rainbow, I think, was a little like it's a little over the top.
Well, we all know what double rainbows are like. I mean, they're epic.
Yeah, and what I think is amazing is that it didn't suffice to have a single rainbow.
No,
that's
double
too
rainbow,
normal.
man.
Yeah,
double rainbow.
That's too normal. I want to point out that the myth of swallow has been attached to a god, the soul of God, or someone who has just passed on, and it's the swallow brings the soul back in a reincarnation. Swallow specifically is a mythic animal, and that goes back way before we're talking about Western tradition.
Doesn't the Bible mention swallows?
It's God. It's the soul of God coming down.
Right. Because God knows all of the swallows. Like, he'll take care of you. Do you know what reference I'm getting at?
No.
I'll look it up for next week. Anyway, I know what I'm thinking. Anyway.
All right. So the Red Army, pre this partition, the Red Army did enter Pyongyang on the 24th of August in 1945, right? So that's the same Red Army we know. They do not talk about the Red Army's involvement in the Pacific, but the Red Army liberated Pyongyang. And you think about the sort of effect that had on North Korea, right? Here you are under the Japanese yoke, and the Red Army liberates you from the Japanese, and they're like, guess what? Self-determination, right? Oh. They did not liberate Seoul, South Korea. They liberated Pyongyang. Mm-hmm. Super important, right? So Stalin instructs. Oh my God, Beria. You guys know who Beria is?
I don't. No.
Head of the secret police under Stalin.
Okay.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh, I saw that movie.
Yeah, right. Death of Stalin, highly recommended. I think this crew loves it already.
Yeah.
If you are listening to this and you have not seen it, you are no friend of ours.
It's on Netflix right now.
It is on Netflix.
There's no reason not to see it.
No excuse for anybody to not see the Death of Stalin. So anyway, Beria of purges and secret police, and he's got a whole awesome story. Stalin's like, who should we install as the communist leader for Soviet occupied territories? And Beria had met with Kim Il-sung several times before, and so Stalin basically says, "Okay, you're our guy," right? And here's an awesome image of young Kim Il-sung immediately following World War II. But I think this image here is going to blow some minds. And here is an image of.
Oh.
Yeah, Kim Il-sung.
Oh, wow.
Stalin. Right? And I think that's.
Smoking a pipe while he's eating?
My guess is that he's not eating.
He's just looking.
I don't know where to start with that.
Right.
Yeah, and I think this was as much a photo op as anything, you know.
Right.
But it's not a photo op. I'm sure this didn't get spread wide in Russia, right? Like this is definitely like this is team Kim here, like with like getting right the liberators. These are the two liberators of Korea, and starting to create that story. And honestly, like, is it a story? No, it is a fact. It is a fact that the Red Army marched into North Korea. It is a fact that that Kim Il-sung was a revolutionary who fought against the Japanese and also helped liberate Korea. These are undeniable facts, and this is where North Korea is starting to show that, like, look, you know, the way of the South isn't the only way. Here are the premises around communism. Here are the premises around socialism, and we're going to build a better state. And you have to think about World War II. Like, we're the U.S., right? It never really touched us. Our way of life was never in danger. Capitalism was never in danger.
Right.
But so many people's way of life was in danger. And here you're presented with two choices. Is it going to be capitalism and democracy as we know it in the West, or is it going to be Soviet-style communism and socialism as it's been? And both of those presented equal opportunity. At that point in time, both of them were racing for the moon, and both of them were advancing industry and science, right? And if you're a Korean, you're looking at them and you're going like, okay, I now have a choice. I now have a world that is in front of me. Is it this shiny new world, or is it this shiny new world? Because communism was still shiny and new and had a lot to offer to a lot of people in those days, right? And so they're like, you know what? Let's do this. And so North Korea is basically Kim Il-sung and referred to as communist dictator Kim Il-sung, but we know how communism works. And these dictators, these dictatorships are also, positions that can be moved around by the Central Committee. And I have no reason to believe that the dictatorship of Kim Il-sung was any different than any of the Soviet premiers that came after Stalin. The only thing is, installation during Stalin probably means a Stalin-style dictatorship, right? So you look at who you are imitating, and you are probably going to be taking some of those lessons to heart. Right? So here we have Korea at this point in time. There's rebuilding, but I feel, and this is important, right? Like, you think about the heartache caused by the division of Germany, right? And you think about the heartache that was caused by the division of Vietnam. And there is a desire to make a thing that is split whole, right?
Right.
And so at a moment of ideological tensions, the beginning of the Cold War, North Korea decides that they're going to attack the South, and they're going to make the Korean Peninsula whole. And so that is the beginning of the North Korean of the Korean War. Backed by communist China and communist Russia.
For broke.
Yeah, why not, man? Why not? Let me tell you something. The way the investments that came into North Korea from Russia and China were significant in comparison to the Western and European investments that were happening in South Korea, right? Like Russia and China were putting their money where their mouth was and supporting a socialist communist country, and the Western states in the U.S. were kind of just looking at South Korea and kind of this sideways look. And at this point in time, anti-communist dictator Syngman Rhee, right? He was a dictator in South Korea when the war broke out. Like, we're not talking about a battle of democracy versus communism. We're talking a battle of dictatorship. And let's face it, anything that's not a dictatorship that is communist dictatorship is a right-wing dictatorship. And right-wing dictatorships are usually closer to fascism than anything else. This was communism against fascism or fascism light. And the U.S. was backing the dictator, and the Russians were backing Kim Il-sung. And the truth is that Russia wasn't too hot on Kim Il-sung, but the U.S. was definitely not hot on Syngman Rhee. And so you're looking kind of like an Iraq kind of situation where there's two areas that are kind of in the same space. And they're about to go at it like crazy, right?
Right. Well,
go ahead.
We're looking at exactly what's going to happen 10 years later in Vietnam.
Exactly.
We don't like him, but he's our guy, and we got to back him.
Yep, exactly. And the U.S. did this over and over and over into the 80s and 90s, and we're still doing it today, right? Like, oh, he's our dictator. Right? Like, we're okay.
It's awful.
Yeah, it's terrible. And honestly, that moral ambiguity for the United States is the source of so many ills of ours in the world stage, because we could have been the good guys, and instead we chose to be the bad guys for the sake of not being the other guy. And it's such a mess. So let's talk a little bit about the Korean War, right? Like, if you guys look at this, and I know it's kind of a tough map to look at because it's tiny in our screen, but if you look at this map, you see that North Korean incursion into South Korea was a done deal. It was done.
Yeah, it was all the way down to Busan.
Yeah. Like, there was a tiny sliver of land that was left in the Korean Peninsula that was going to be that was still guarded by the South Koreans.
Right.
But then the U.S. and the United Nations intervene, and the UN does a declaration going like, oh, you can't invade sovereign land or anything, even though the Korean Peninsula, like, the UN doesn't interfere in civil wars, but because of this unnatural partition between the North and the South, done after World War II, now it's not considered a civil war. If this were considered, if the name of the Korean War was called the Korean Civil War, there would not have been the kind of U.S. Intrusion that there was. But because it was colored by the Cold War, the U.S. and the UN intervened, and they pushed North Korean forces back to the 38th parallel. Right. And so what you're looking at here is like this line moved so much over the 3 years of the Korean War that the capital city of South Korea, Seoul, South Korea, was taken over 4 times. It changed hands 4 times. For a capital city, anyone who's played Risk knows that once you take the capital, or once you take the capital of your empire, that's it, right? And yet here we have the North Korean, the South Korean capital taken 4 times, right?
Right.
You see the worst instincts of a war-weary U.S. come forward, right? Like, the U.S. just finished World War II. This is 1950. World War II ended in 1947. This is just a few years later, and we're tired, right?
Well, and a lot of the guys are physically still there. They are physically tired.
Yeah.
Like they're done, right? Right. So,
Exactly.
and it is this war of attrition, because I just want to jump in. Sorry,
Go
you
ahead.
talked about the North Koreans pushed all the way down to the southeastern part of the country, and then once the Allies landed, or the UN landed, they pushed the North Koreans all the way back up to the river up here, right? Which is when China invaded with hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
So it's
It's
called the
like,
Forgotten
boom,
War. It's
boom.
what a mess.
Yeah, what a mess is right. And then you get that desperation from the US, and they talk about deploying nuclear bombs. And they actually, back in those days, nuclear bombs were these VW bug sized things. They weren't the missiles that we see now. We're talking about the Fat Man and Little Boy
Right.
bombs, and they flew them and put them in Korea, and they're like, just in case, right? Like, and you're looking at generals like MacArthur. I mean, MacArthur was undefeated against the Japanese, but the Korean War ended his career.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
Because he wanted to be savage, crazy, firebombing MacArthur. And at this point, it's already starting to seep into the US just how damaging like the way it conducted war against in World War II is. And everybody's kind of like, no. So you see World War II generals like MacArthur wanting to firebomb Korea into oblivion. And the US drops 635,000 tons of bombs on North Korea, 32,000 tons of napalm, right? And this is before the Vietnam War. So in per capita and in absolute terms, North Korea was the country most devastated by the Korean War, right? And 12 to 15% of the North Korean population dies by the time the war is over. And I say over with quotes because it's not actually over. It's still not over.
No.
By the time the war is over in 1953, the 15% of the North Korean, and some people say it's as high as 20% of the North Korean population is dead. Yeah. So of import also, when you look at North Korea devastated by this war after just gaining its footing from 1948, right? Like this is less than a 10-year period. They cast off the Japanese, started a war against the South, almost took it over, got pushed back almost to the Chinese border, then pushed all the way back to the 38th parallel, then finally finally got down to the 38th parallel, and everybody just stopped. They didn't declare peace, they just stopped. They're like, okay, we're good here. And that's it.
Literally right where we started.
Yep.
Literally right where we started.
Yep.
It's a fascinating little event in history.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that always it's so sad how much life and treasure, how much blood and treasure was spilled for no results whatsoever and no changes. But that's a lie, right? Like no changes is obviously this kind of cataclysmic event in your homeland, in your country, changes you. And it did that to North Korea, right? Like here we are, a protege of Stalin in a way, just finished his war in 1953, and also in 1953, Stalin dies. So the death of Stalin is important, and it was a movie, and it is a hallmark for the communist world because Stalinism dies with him, because Stalinism is definitely a brutal way of conducting a communist government. And while traces of Stalinism would exist in Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, who immediately followed Stalin, made a valiant effort at trying to get back to what the Russian Revolution was originally about, and you did see like a bit of a golden era for the Soviet Union immediately following World War II and immediately following Stalin's death in 1953. But one of the things that happened after Stalin's death is something called de-Stalinification, right? Where you're just like, okay, we can take down every statue, not every statue, but most of the statues of Stalin, because there were statues of Stalin everywhere. And we can kind of lean back on some of these rules where you cannot set your drink down on a picture of Stalin because the secret police will come in and take you off and beat you for several hours for defacing the face of Stalin, right? And so de-Stalinization became an important factor in Russia, and when that started happening in China, right? Like they're just like, yeah, China's like backing off a little bit. They're like, we're doing good with Mao. Like he's actually like, it's good for us to have him as the head of this and sort of deify him. So we're going to do our own thing. And North Korea decided to also agree that Kim Il Sung was doing okay, sort of still as being a strong man and still having his face there. And so as the Soviet Union sort of starts pulling back a little bit on their cult of personality around Stalin, what you see is the beginning of a double down on Korea for a cult of personality around Kim Il Sung. Mm-hmm. And so statues start going up. He's seen as the savior of the country. And in 1955, Kim Il Sung comes up with what is oh, you know what? I jumped ahead. So let's actually go back to the Korean War, because I think with all of the deaths and all of that, it's important for us to think about atrocities committed during the war. And my apologies to everybody. We're just rewinding a few years. We're still on death of Stalin 1953, end of the war 1953. But remember, these are people who have suffered, right? And here is the end of a very savage war that destroyed almost 20% of their population. And from that emerges a mythology and a story of fighting for freedom and fighting for their land and fighting on behalf of themselves, right? Because remember, at one point, the US and UN forces invaded North Korea and made it almost all the way up, and then were pushed back down, right? And
the
so
Yalu River, I spaced it. The Yalu River is the important river.
There you go. And so what ends up happening is then stories become once again, you re-up the story of pushing out the oppressor as you did the Japanese. Even though you started it, you're pushing out the oppressor because the oppressor got on top of you. And so here we have, right, the beginning of the US as the occupier and the US as the imperialist. And you think
this blonde Aryan fellow down here getting punched in the face.
Yeah, and you think of what a war looks like for these folks, and the difficulties that they endured, and you think of what a war-weary U.S. must have been like during the Korean War. They're like, "Fuck, we have to fight another one," right?
Right.
And there's plenty of room to believe that both South Korea and the United States committed atrocities towards North Korea in the same way that North Korea committed purges when they occupied space in South Korea, but also the U.S. And the savagery of the war. You got to think of the first push of the war was easy in the sense that it was almost a clean sweep right off the bat. The push back was difficult, and then this back and forth was just horrific. So the atrocities down here were one level, the atrocities up here were another level, but the atrocities that happened in this moment were something else. Mm-hmm. And so go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're looking at a bit of a replay, not exactly tactically, but a bit of a replay of World War I here, where we're fighting over, at best, miles of ground, usually feet.
Yeah.
Right? And entrenchments and populations displaced and destroyed, and it was
rough.
Go ahead. It was awful.
So I'm going to show here some images here, and this is a picture for those of you at home who are listening. It's a picture of a Korean soldier and a U.S. soldier throwing a baby into a well. Yeah. Here's another image. This is a picture of U.S. soldiers removing the teeth from a Korean woman in traditional garb, and there's also hot pokers in the picture with the promise of more punishment. Here's a picture of this is actually a photograph of a museum in North Korea dedicated to American atrocities during the Korean War. And this is a picture of a tied down North Korean being basically having his skull split as Americans look on and laugh. And then I might be wrong here, but I believe this is an image of US soldiers pushing a village of North Koreans into a cave that they plan on blowing up. Right, and in the foreground of this photograph, you see it's a painting, and then in the foreground is a North Korean tour guide pointing out this atrocity. Right, and then this picture I think is super important, and it is also a picture of a person being burned alive by American and Korean troops, this is a photograph of a museum exhibit. And you look at the faces of the North Koreans that are walking by this museum exhibit, and they look disturbed, right? Like that
obviously.
Yeah, and honestly, like, how much of this is based in truth? How much has been manipulated in order to be of use to the North Korean government? I would venture to say, if this had happened, would the U.S. government be okay with talking about it? We think about My Lai, was that it in Vietnam?
My Lai.
Those massacres and how the U.S. government tried to hide those, and how U.S. troops behaved then, and I think in history. I had a really amazing history professor in high school named Mr. Davis, and one of the things he used to say is a little bit of both.
Yeah, I mean, were there atrocities probably committed by American troops, certain units and certain individuals that were pretty disturbing? Probably. I see a lot of propaganda. I see a lot of propaganda in this.
I do too.
Yeah,
I do too. But right? I do think about.
But the thing is, you have to realize that these are also like stories. So what we're hearing here is, so let's say a battle or something went really wrong for both sides. One side is going to say, "Well, I saw the American troops ripping out women's teeth with hot pokers."
Exactly.
You know? But I promise you that you can find some American veterans here that will tell you that they saw, and they probably didn't see, but they heard rumors that if you get captured by the North Koreans, this is going to happen to you. You know, this is part of the, I guess you could call it psychological warfare.
Yeah.
Warfare.
Yeah. Well, I mean, warfare messes you up. Warfare also, like, you have to dehumanize the opponent, because if you think that you're killing a person with a family and a home and something to live for, it's more difficult to kill them. Whereas if you're thinking you're killing an animal that like a monster who burns people alive, that's easier, right? And look, like, we have our own stories around the Korean War. The Manchurian Candidate is literally post-Korean War propaganda vilifying North Koreans as deviant in our heads, right? So anyway,
still a good movie.
It's a great movie, right? So you think about the psychology, you think about the death of Stalin, and you think like Kim Il Sung is in a situation now where he needs to solidify himself, and everyone's saying, "No, pull back, pull back." Where Stalin was doing it wrong. Everything you know about how to run a country and everything you learned is wrong. And forgive me and forgive him as he rebuilds his country. But he's like, you know what? The idea of Juche, it means self-reliance. And Korea has been messed around with for way too long. And our national identity will now be around Juche, which means we're not going to do things the way Russia's doing it. We're not going to do things the way China is doing it. And we're definitely not doing it the way the Americans and South Korea is doing it. We're going to do things the North Korean way.
Right.
We're going to establish our own identity. Right. And I think that is an honest way of looking at the mentality behind Kim Il Sung and maybe some original thinking. And yes, it's a little benevolent, right? Like there's always power. You've got to love it, right? You're the leader. You're the beloved leader, the great leader. And so I think it's important to pay attention to that, but also like there is little difference from this guy to a dozen other guys who are doing the exact same thing, and I find it amusing and laughable that in the United States we refer to Korea as part of the axis of evil. You know, like looping them in as villainous as any old terrorist, right? It's so laughable, and the vilification of this country is so ridiculous at times. There is a reason for it later on that we can try to understand. But look at what this country was forged in, and look at the leadership at this point in time. Look at where they came from, and it's linear, it's straightforward, right? And the cult of personality doesn't deviate and doesn't get what I would refer to as bizarre from a Western standpoint until later. And obviously, I mean, it's a short history, so it's not much later. But I do want to show that images here of Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Il with children are very similar to images at the time of Mao and Stalin and other leaders. And there's really very little difference from the veneration of leadership in North Korea than there is of veneration of leadership in other countries.
Right. Well, I think what's interesting about Juche is it really, and we'll talk about it next time as you know, as we said, but there's such a nationalist ethnic component to it, right? That starts to get in there. But the thing is it's not the same as European ethno-fascism.
Or communism.
It's kind of it's kind of similar. It's got lines that sort of connect, but like it's not the same. Like you can't say that it's an Eastern version or a Korean version of Nazism. Like it's not.
No. It is a whole. It is its own thing, and I think that's also important, right? For years they are somebody else's thing, and here Stalin dies, and they're trying to tell him what to do, and he's like, you know what, Juche, talk to it, because that's where we're at. And I think that's there's something to be admired about that. And you know, there's one thing that I do want to point out, and we'll get into that right now actually, is that sorry, Brassy.
Hey, sorry, I keep getting kicked off.
Well, it's all good. It's all good. So one of the things that I think is going to be super important for us to note is that, and here's something that I absolutely love, and it is something that eventually comes, like this flower will come full circle. And the name of this flower is Kim Il Sung. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this flower was presented by to Kim Il-sung by Sukarto of Indonesia. Not Suharto, Sukarto. And that's important. That's an important distinction. But Sukarto is the Indonesian freedom fighter who liberated Indonesia from the Dutch.
Okay.
And he invited Kim Il-sung to Indonesia. And there are certain undeniables in this world. And that is the respect of freedom fighters have for each other, right? Like there's a letter that that MLK sent to Cesar Chavez, right? And an acknowledgement of their joint fight. And for all we can say about Kim Il-sung, and I like saying these things, like it feels strange to me, right? Because I'm an American, and my cultural identity is also tied into like a distrust of these communist dictatorships. But Sukarto is undeniably somebody who liberated a colony and liberated it from colonialism, very much in the same way that Kim Il-sung helped liberate Korea from the Japanese. They were both freedom fighters, and Sukarto invited him to Indonesia. And that is important because Indonesia was not a communist place. In fact, later on, Indonesia goes off the deep end with Pancasila and all sorts of like crazy right-wing stuff. But in this moment, there's an acknowledgement from freedom fighter to freedom fighter. This flower, Kim Jong-il, or sorry, Kim Il-sung, sorry, Kim Il-sung. I've had trouble with the Kims the entire time, but Kim Il-sung was a flower that had been grown specifically for Sukarto's garden. And Kim Il-sung was so like enamored with the idea of this flower that was grown just for him. He's like, this is amazing. I love it. And Sukarto's like, you know what? We're going to name the flower after you. Right? That's so flower, blah, 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 anecdote, blah, blah, blah. Revolutionary to revolutionary, an act, a gesture of affection from one to the other. It speaks to the place that that Kim Il-sung should have in history, and not necessarily to the cult of personality that we will see later on that makes us as Americans uncomfortable, right? And I'm just going to hide the flowers here. And show you guys how the flower then became part of the veneration of Kim Il-sung. And something of import around Kim Il-sung and for us to take into consideration about North Korea under Kim Il-sung. In the after the war, 4 years after the war, right? 1957, industrial production of in North Korea was back to what it was in 1949. By 1959, relations with Japan had improved, and they let Japanese citizens in the country go back to Japan. That year, the North Korean won had greater value than the South Korean won. Right? Think about that. Right. 1959, the economy of North Korea was stronger than that of South Korea, right?
Well, South Korea was essentially, I mean, sorry, I don't want to come across insulting, but basically a third world country until the 1970s.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And here's North Korea revalued the North Korean won. Until the 1960s, economic growth was higher in North Korea than in South Korea. GDP was equal, if not higher, than that of its southern neighbor up until 1976.
Okay, right.
So we're talking about after these wars and after this period of really severe severe deprivation, Kim Il Sung suddenly finds himself in a period of growth that shows up the West, and he also has one kind of. There's a comment made by Kim Il Sung that kind of alludes to what may come, and this is what Kim Il Sung says. My grandfather's opinion was that if pupils peep into their teacher's private life frequently, they lose their awe of him. The teacher must give his pupils the firm belief that their teacher neither eats nor urinates. Only then he can maintain his authority of school. So a teacher should set up a screen and live behind it.
This is like Plato. This is Plato's school of Socrates never write anything down.
And so what happens is he starts building a mystery around himself. Right. And that feeds into a cult of personality. And eventually that cult of personality will come back and become something completely different. But as kind of the world continued in 1980, the economy of North Korea began to stagnate. It started a decline. In 1987, it had basically collapsed, and then the Soviet Union totally destroyed it in 1991 when all of that exchange ended. And then in 1991 is when the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1994, Kim Il Sung died of a heart attack. And then Kim Jong-il declared a national mourning period of 3 years, right? So think about that for a second. Kim Il Sung dies, 3 years of mourning as we get our stuff together.
Right.
And those people who were found violating the mourning rules, no drinking, were met with punishment. After his death, he was referred to as the eternal president, and the national constitution was changed to reflect this. And this is an important piece of learning. When his father died, Kim Jong-il greatly expanded the nation's cult of personality.
Right. Well, it's completely obvious to me that the 3 years is basically an establishment of martial law to establish power to solidify his own regime.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
like that's obviously what it was.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot to be said about like that moment, and that's why we came to like a natural pause there. I did not want to continue this conversation past there because I think Kim Jong-il is going to be a whole other thing, and all of the wild stuff that we see and the stuff that really has captured our imagination over the last few years. And even to today, right, as we're like, what's Kim Jong-un up to, right? Like People Magazine, Kim Jong-un, where's he hiding?
Well, they traded fire this morning.
That's right, they traded fire this morning. So I think it's been a whole to do, and it's something that we can go into next week. But yeah, that's where I'm going to end it today.
Okay, so two things I want to talk about. One is for Brass.
Oh yeah.
Let's try to remember about the Socrates thing.
Yeah.
Because I want to bring that up with the father, the son, and the grandson about regimes, and it's a little philosophical. I get it. And regimes and the declining of regimes, right? From better to worse to awful. And then I think another interesting thing to bring up is you talked in 1976 is when South Korea economy started to go. There was obviously some liberalization politically going on, but one thing we cannot deny is the that also sort of marks the outsourcing of industrial factories from the United States.
Yep.
Right.
Ooh.
So just how all of this gets combined. Right?
Yep.
How much stuff do you have that still to this day, even though Korea is a major power, or certainly a major power in the world, I would say South Korea is like, how much stuff do you still own that still says made in Korea? Right. Tons of it. I can go through all sorts of stuff out here. So it's a I've enjoyed this.
Yeah,
And
right.
it's going to get weirder and more fun.
It does get a little bit wild, right? Like the cult of personality gets supercharged in the next few decades, and then what Kim Jong-un is handed, which is relatively recent, is a whole different animal than what Kim Jong-il was handed, and in a way, Kim Jong-il had more of a hand in creating what he was handed than Kim Jong-un did. But we can get into that later. Let's do some show and tell.
Next week.
What do we got?
Perfect. You go.
I go. Okay.
Or
Show and tell.
What? Show and tell. Okay, just a second because I got to grab it.
Oh.
I know.
Dan, Socrates is famously known for not believing that in order to learn that you write it down. He thought once you've written it down, you've sullied the idea, throw it away. But that true learning, true education only happened orally, passing it on from the teacher to the student. And oftentimes he would teach from behind a screen. You were not allowed to look at your instructor in Socratic method.
I do agree with the writing, which is why I never wrote papers in college.
How did you graduate? When I did that, I got bad grades. So how did you do that?
I mean, we're making a podcast.
I finally realized that it wasn't going to happen, so I started writing some things down.
God knows we don't want to commit to paper any of this because then it's traceable. Just a little fun fact. I once dated a woman who's deaf and wasn't very good at lip reading, so we write a lot of our conversations together down. And you don't realize how much bullshit you sling on an average date until somebody can reference back to it and go like, no, this is what you said earlier.
Oh, geez.
No.
Yeah.
Right. It's very Marley Maitland in West Wing with Josh Lyman.
Yep, that's right.
You cannot trick her. She won't be tricked. Joey Lucas will not be tricked.
All right, so this is my show and tell. Earlier this week, in Mexico City, a prize was given to a diplomat, a person who works in the diplomatic service, called the Alfredo Lamont Prize. It is a prize given to diplomats for their service in Mexico Middle East relations.
Wow.
And the reason that prize is named after my grandfather is because my grandfather was one of the people who first made efforts towards Islamic countries to establish cultural relationships. And I have here, and this isn't necessarily a Muslim or Middle Eastern country, but we can see here that this is a medal for the Ethiopian Mexican Cultural Society.
Wow.
My grandfather. There's also a Tunisian one somewhere and an Algerian one. But my grandfather, you can see the medal right there.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And there's a prize now in Mexico City, in Mexico, that's given out by the government, named after my grandfather. It was given out earlier this week. I'll post about it in the Facebook page. But that's my show and tell.
Fantastic.
That's awesome. That's a good one.
That's really
cool.
Team.
Well done.
What you got, Dan?
You should be very proud of it.
I am. It's cool.
So I actually forgot about show and tell this week. So I was looking up something. Hold on. I was looking up something during the show, and we started talking about the veneration of leaderships. And I wanted to show people, I thought of something. Oh, speaking of veneration of leadership. So it's just a photo on my iPhone.
Oh.
This is called the apotheosis or the rising up of Washington. If you don't think that we religiously raise our leaders up in this country, this is on the dome of the Capitol building.
Oh.
All of the women, you can see Mr. Washington at the 6 o'clock position. Hold on. Mr. Washington at my 6 o'clock position. And then all of the ladies are the 13 colonies. And they're all holding some sort of like wonderful thing that makes America great. And then I believe the banner says E pluribus unum. So there you go. You want to talk about religious rising up of leaders? And that's on our national cathedral, right? The Capitol.
Yeah. And Dan, you and I have talked about how uncomfortable that makes us.
Oh yeah. Remember? You and I were in there for like 2 hours talking.
Yeah. About it. And the truth is like are you kidding me? Like people are falling over themselves, like trying to make fun of Korea, and we have that embarrassment.
Well, you know what I want to do? I'd love to dig up George Washington and bring him back and show him that, and I could just imagine him just, what is that thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
So
he would hate it.
Of course, of course.
I think he would hate it.
Oh, he'd hate it beyond belief. But it is an epic painting. I mean, it's well done.
The Wikipedia says that each figure painted on that fresca is 15 feet tall.
They're amazing.
Each person.
I got the opportunity to go to the dome to see it like right in front of your face.
Wow.
It's nuts.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Beautiful.
each one of their heads is as big as your body.
Yeah. That's wild.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Brett,
that's
do you have
mine.
any show and tell?
I do. I have a favorite YouTube cooking show that I love, and she's a South Korean woman named Manchi. Manchi a few years ago featured a recipe that was rather somber and serious because she's a very cool, crazy lady. But she put on a recipe that was North Korean once, and I've never cried during a cooking show, but this got me. It's an eggplant dish that's very spicy, and it's inspired by the following, if you'll bear with me. I was inspired to develop this recipe by watching a Korean TV show about a family who escaped from North Korea 12 years ago. To defect to South Korea, they first had to cross the border to China. During the crossing, they got caught by Chinese police. The police gave them a choice. Either the whole family goes back to North Korea, or just the daughter goes back by herself, and the rest of the family goes through China. Both options were terrible, but they decided that the daughter would go back to North Korea alone, and the rest of the family would go through China. Probably the mother told the daughter she would bring her as soon as they settled in South Korea, but it never came to be. When they got to South Korea, they tried hard to find their daughter, but they could not get any information at all. She and her husband are still currently living near the border and trying to find her to this day. She said, "My daughter's favorite food was spicy eggplant. So whenever I make this dish of steamed chili pepper and steamed eggplant, we mix it with rice. It breaks my heart when we eat this so deliciously." This was shown on a Korean TV show. Manchi was watching it. She decided to take that recipe and make it for everybody and tell the story about this family that defected and lost their daughter in the process. This is her favorite dish.
Wow.
There you go. You win show and tell, Brass.
And it is a good show and tell, Brassy, because it does highlight, the right, like my admiration and my romanticization of some of these freedom fighters. You cannot hide the human cost behind all of these different things, and we will get deep into the human cost and all of that on the next history happy hour. But thank you, everybody. That was amazing, and definitely under 2 hours.
Bye, everyone.
So let's see it out. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.
You.